yeah, what your kind of thoughts or questions are about the new network.
I like that there's like one of the three types of groups is really designated for projects or more geared towards doing work, because I think that was, with the working groups, I think some working groups had projects and then sometimes they had projects or didn't. And it was hard to, I think, explain to someone that was new to the network, well, you go to this working group meeting, you don't necessarily work at anything. And so kind of separating that, the education, information, and coordination of a topic exchange versus a team that is actually working on a project, I think is really going to be helpful.
Yeah. That I appreciate that, and glad that distinction came through. And I think that's something that, we definitely learned over the years, is that we put a lot of expectations on the working groups to be a place of that information exchange, and also then generating the project teams when, and also when we have a strategic plan that identifies things that need to be done, in addition to making sure there's coordination and communication. So yeah, I'm happy that distinction comes through and that you're seeing that and appreciating it. That's good to hear. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I have questions about sort of action steps and actionability, but I also was hoping to have more time to sit with the graphics and the list of those, because I think my understanding was it's not up online yet.
No. Yeah,
so I didn't know if we could share that would be great. I think, but in terms of actionability, yeah, I'm curious. I like this also, and I'm curious if you all have considered sort of funding structure and support around fundraising around those strategy teams, and to what degree is their work going to require dedicated funding? And if you guys have thought about that at all, where the sort of planning process is around that?
Yeah, and I don't know which slide in particular would be helpful to have up, or we can kind of go through them. Yeah. And so since you're talking about the priority strategy teams, and that's a really good question. And it's multifaceted. So we plan to be able to support people's participation in those groups as needed, especially at a leadership level. If someone is stepping up to say, yeah, I want to be the point on this, and kind of co-lead the group. That's similar to now how we support chairs of our groups with a chair stipend. So we have that capacity to help kind of resource the participation as needed. And then also another reason for kind of, having these designated priority strategy teams, which are focused on implementation, is that we have also found that from our perspective, that makes it easier for us to provide our capacity to help raise resources to fund those projects. So they might not have project funding to start, but part of then what we can bring to the table is helping put a grant proposal together, kind of searching out what grants and funding opportunities align with that strategy, and how we can then in turn fund it. And then I think too, there might be some of these teams might operate differently in that some of the priority strategies that they're related to, take for instance the food security plan team, that priority strategy in the plan is super well defined. It's like create a food security plan. So that team, and there's already resources behind that project, and Becca Warren is actually leading that process. That team has a very discrete thing to implement, and so that's they're off and running. Whereas some of the other ones will require some level of additional strategy development and prioritization of what's the first thing we need to do in order to influence or implement this priority strategy, which encompasses a number of things that are kind of baked and packed into it. So I think there's still going to be some level of variation in how the teams operate in their beginning phases. But yes, that we feel like where we want to put our resources and ability to raise resources is into these teams, whereas the communities of practice and the exchanges are kind of a little lighter lift for facilitation and support that we need to provide. And that's not to say we won't provide support to those teams, but it's just of a lesser, I think, degree than what we see is needed for these priority strategy teams. So does that generally answer or raise any additional questions?
Yeah, do you have any examples of sort of like specific directions you see any of these folks taking? I mean, I get the sense of based on sort of the how formal or how well along the road the like conversation is around food security, that like a plan would be developed. I guess I'm curious if you have ideas about directions the others will take.
Yeah. So going down the list, so the meat supply chain team has actually been kind of meeting for a while now, and it's the direction there is coming from a priority strategy around increasing processing capacity, but also just the general supply chain of production processing for meat products. And so we do actually have a WeLab funded grant that will be official soon, that's helping support some work that Kevin Channel and Juan Alves are going to be doing together with some producers around genetics and actually dairy beef development. So that group is one that I think will have a lot of sort of sub projects stemming out of it, and kind of it's both a body to coordinate that activity, and also for us then to develop specific projects and get it funded. The agroforestry team, they just had a first meeting a few weeks ago. They are in the process of looking through some of the specific recommendations from the agroforestry brief and identifying sort of where they want to direct their focus and attention to. But they, and I think they're acknowledging too that after the first meeting, there's still a couple more people that need to come into the fold. And so they're more in that kind of prioritization process. The retail grocers team is one that we have, project funding through the agency, a FSMIP grant to do retail development. But what we haven't done in the past, we've been doing that project for a long time, is we haven't necessarily brought together a team around sort of thinking strategically about retail market development. And so the idea there is to pair some of the existing project work that's funded with a team of both advisors, but also a group of people that will help kind of look further out than just the project that's underway, and think about other ways to kind of influence in that market channel. The policy team is one that I'm planning to put out a call for this. So there's a strategy for the policy team, a priority strategy around developing a policy roadmap that would be updated each year, that identifies, proactively identifies policy priorities amongst ag stakeholders in Vermont, that we're less in a reactive mode when the legislature opens in January, and more in a proactive mindset, where we can really get out in front of issues and be sort of, as a community, be proposing policies before those policies are maybe being proposed to food and ag stakeholders, as sometimes is the case. And so that team would operate as sort of defining the policy issues for the next year and beyond, and monitoring those policies and helping to coordinate activity around, whether it's not lobbying, but just sort of the legislative process of how to get those things passed, or how to just be more active in total as a community. And there's certain entities that can be more active in the legislature, And so it's just also helping identify issues for them so that, they're helping to push along policies of agreement in the legislature. The ag distribution and storage infrastructure team is one that will be an extension of some conversations that have emerged out of the ag and distribution working group. So I think there has been an identified need to better sort of assess the assets across the state related to aggregation, storage, distribution and storage, and how to coordinate those resources. And I know some of that's happening in the Food Hub Collaborative, but also some of that just needs to happen more broadly amongst like the independent distributors, including the food hubs, plus farms that are doing self-distribution, and just how do we identify those assets, coordinate them better, and also make a case for greater investment that's strategically smart and creating efficiencies in that system. So that's the plan with that, and that's another one that I kind of see being probably in the next couple months, like starting to form that group and get people together around that idea. The equity action plan is something that is a specific recommendation both in the equity brief, and it's sort of framed a little differently as a priority strategy. But essentially, having a plan of action for our network that relates to how we're addressing racial equity, and a group sort of working through that process, because we know that there's a lot more we need to think through, and as was mentioned by Megan, just like relationships that need to develop, and that team would kind of be responsible for taking that on, identifying the gaps and kind of our own policies and practices that are problematic, or places where we just need to more explicitly and deliberately address equity in the network, and then sort of beyond that. Marketing team is that one, I would say, needs more thought and development, because I think with marketing, there's a lot of different ideas and a lot of different levels of sort of how people approach marketing, whether it's like skill-based development for individual enterprises, or one of the ideas that is sort of baked into the priority strategy is hosting more of like quarterly sessions around marketing trends, marketing practices, that is just a value to producers, but also organizations working in the food system to better understand, the best practices, trends around marketing, things that are happening in that world, and also bring in professionals in the marketing world to kind of convey that and provide some professional development to all of us in the marketing as it relates to marketing. Food ag literacy team is essentially would be more of a bringing together stakeholders who work around consumer education and just general food and ag literacy and education, to do a research project to understand efficacy around those efforts, just not sort of right now. It was acknowledged in the briefs related to this that there's a lot of activities around ag literacy, food literacy, ag and food education, but there's not necessarily a sense of what works well with certain populations. And so just honing in on some of those factors through research would be the project there of that team. The TA capacity team is related to there's two priority strategies that, and the plan itself is making a recommendation that we need greater TA capacity for a number of specific product areas, but also just general added capacity in the system for business planning. And that one, I think we have a working idea, but the process around that needs to be defined, of like, how do we prioritize what product categories receive additional capacity? What are the means to defining that and making strategic decisions, and then how ultimately does that get funded is another question. And some of those issues, I think, I've been thinking about relate to the indicators, community practice now is what we're calling it, the viability indicators group of, how do we assess viability for an industry, and then in that way make the case for the need for additional TA capacity, whether it's production or business planning for that industry. And then the financing for farmland access team is going to be looking more at sort of the alternative financing model. So there was in the last farmland access and stewardship working group, so it's an extension of that working group. There was acknowledgement that there's more development around that needs to happen, looking beyond just kind of traditional financing, which also I think there's a lot of activity around that to begin with. So that group has kind of some working ideas that there will be some planned meetings to further refine what that will look like from a project perspective. So that's the
awesome. Yeah. Probably the sign of a good network that it's tempting to join a lot of different conversations. too many to be practical.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Yeah, I was looking at this list last night, just sort of prepping us. It's a lot, and also, as I said too, we have to pace, as sort of the support body, we have to pace ourselves as well. And so, there's some things here that we need to help get off the ground, and then once we do, we might be freed up to move our attention, focus, and resources to other areas. But that we can't necessarily tackle all these things simultaneously with full effort and support. And so there will be some sequencing and prioritization that I have, my team has to think about with all of this as well, and acknowledge those limitations. It is by design, this is a 10-year plan, and so we just have to recognize that some things are further along than others right now, and just keep reminding ourselves and everyone of that too.
Is that what, Jake, is that why you have the 3 top ones bolded? Is that what you're starting with it as the sort of?
The bolded ones are ones that have they've already convened.
Oh, yeah, you said that. Okay.
A group of people. Yeah. And then I would say the Grocers team, policy team, infrastructure, and equity are the ones that I see us helping to cultivate in the next 3 to 6 months. And then
I had a question about the equity team, Jake, and I deliberately didn't go on that breakout group because I assume that there might be a lot of people jumping into that discussion. And I'm curious how you are thinking about building that team so that it doesn't end up being dominated by white-led organizations that want to align themselves and be an ally in racial equity versus being led through a team, through Relief and other members, hopefully other members of the Farm to Plate network. How do you balance that in such a white-led space of the network, I guess? Yeah. And then the second part of that question is, how do you ensure that it doesn't get siloed in just a team when in fact you could, through all these priority strategies, have a bullet point of what should we be thinking about in terms of racial equity for the policy team, for the retail grocers team, for, you could per se build it into every single team. So I'm just curious how you're balancing those two things.
Yeah. I think part of as I mentioned, the equity brief has a specific recommendation for the Farm to Plate network to develop a plan of action, and there's some conditions around sort of the BIPOC participation and leadership of that. But the charge is for the network to develop this plan of action, which would include, I think, the elements that you're talking about of how do other groups are other groups required to examine equity in the work that they're doing? I think we need to better articulate that, and develop, that's sort of the plan of action is to identify those elements and then start to instill it into how we operate as a network. And so we're at a point where it's like, we're not at a place right now where we can actually give what I think there's some basic guidance we can give around that, but I think there's more work that we need to do. And part of that too is, what Megan was saying is some of that isn't big pronouncements, but some of that is, say, this team of what might be white, a lot of white people talking with members of Relief in a very individual basis. And so I think there's just that team is something that I think it's going to take time. And I don't want to create this sense of, that there's a big, I don't want to create big pronouncements and expectations around things that I think still need to get, where there's still conversations and relationships that need to develop to define what those things are. Who's a part of it and who needs to be a part of it, and how does that work in practice? Because some of the conversations that I've had, say, with Liv around this, is just that, they have created a space to have those conversations, right? And so I don't want to also present it as like, now Farm to Plate owns sort of the conversation around racial equity in the food system in Vermont. It's, I think, more nuanced than that, and that's just something that also, in navigating this conversation with network members, has been hard to kind of say, like, how do we present this? How do we talk about this in a way that feels authentic and that it's important to us, but we're also not setting ourselves up to kind of reproduce maybe some of the sort of white-led organizations claiming something and being kind of in this savior mentality. And so that dynamic is very nuanced, and that's the part of it that I think we need to give ourselves some time to like work through those issues and have some really hard conversations about it, have some back and forth and relationship development that is a part of that process. So
who's leading the racial equity action plan team?
So that's one of the right now the
discussion items.
Is does that need to be facilitated by an outside entity? Because it's a tricky thing for any one person to lead that process, and there's a lot of, I think, facilitation skills required in doing that. And so I don't necessarily, that is not going to be just an open call to say, is there a network member interested in leading this process? I think there's going to be, I think part of the conversation of that team formation is about how does this get led? Do we need some additional facilitation capacity to help us through that process of then defining, like, what are the norms and leadership? What's the leadership structure? What's the process that team undertakes to develop the plan?
Great. I don't want to dominate, but it just seems really complex. I guess the one thing I would say is that Megan just offered a lot in her presentation. And one of the things I heard her talk about was just how people in Vermont that the members of Relief get often featured in their company's website or catalog as like their diversity photo. And I'm super hyper aware of that in terms of across the country. You can see it in commercial catalogs as well, but I see it here in Vermont as particularly problematic. And so that, like, when you think about marketing and food and ag literacy and all of this, like, how do we build a communication piece for checking ourselves, whether or not the team can provide sort of a structured way of checking our intentions, and having a sort of a place to discuss the challenges that each team faces as they're thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely. And part of this, like, we're going through this process internally as the backbone staff of looking at all the various ways of the things that we do and what are our practices and areas of sort of checking ourselves. And a lot of that too relates to communications. Is like, what does effective communication around this look like that isn't kind of tokenism, isn't portraying something symbolically that's actually not the case in reality. And so I think that's helping us inform also how we think about the setup and design of the equity action plan team.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other last questions or thoughts or reflections before we have a lunch break?
Just wanted to see the other list real quick.
Oh yeah,
to write it down.
We're stuck on the slide.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So Daniel, as I mentioned, the farm viability indicators, what was the task force, is we're now calling it community practice. And I've talked with Liz a little bit about this. And it felt like a natural transition because that group sort of, it sort of informally meets periodically and drives the agenda and the conversations that happen. And it's really about, I think, the sort of skill development around indicators and farm viability. So that's sort of why that shows up there. And then the other groups too are kind of in transitioning from the old network structure to the new. Those felt like good fits for communities of practice because they've been operating for a long time in that manner. And then the topic exchanges. So some of the materials that will go out following this will, I think, map this out a little more in detail. So we built these like mind maps and then started to look at a high level, how could you categorize the 30, if you group the 34 priority strategies by sort of higher level categories and interrelationships, we ended up kind of with these 5 topic areas. But we could certainly, there may be instances where we need to distinguish things a little more and create a 6 topic exchange or whatever it may be. And then the full network exchange was really, I think, motivated by some of the COVID task force calls that we were hosting, and just seeing the value of like, wow, it's amazing that we can bring together 90 people in the state and just create some great, like, larger situational awareness of what's happening across different areas of the food system. And it's a very like low barrier of entry. Like anyone, you don't necessarily have to be giving an update to gain value and being present for that type of thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it. I'm really excited. I think it seems really well thought through, and I'm excited to learn more, but I'm glad that viability indicators is existing again in some form. I think they're making more space in their funding for economic research, and I think we'll be able to that group will be able to be sort of a vetter and advisory group informally for some real economic research around farm viability in the next 3 or 4 years. So
great. It's good to hear that too, because I think there's potential there, and just thinking about that sort of TA, the question around TA capacity feels like a lot of that relates to that type of research, and just grounding it first before we start making those investments.
Great.
Awesome.
Okay, go get something to eat.
Yeah, thanks. All right, cool. Thanks, Daniel. All right.